Welcome to Friday night's video in our second master series. I do believe this is the 75th video in our second master series, the 24th video in our basic processor, and 11th video dealing with reverb and convolution. And we're talking about testing our reverb. First of all, before we say anything, is I do believe that it would be a good idea for you to look on my channel anything about reverberation and acoustics, and to get on the internet, Wikipedia, and wherever else you can find information. Just read about reverberation, follow the links, convolution reverb, normal reverberation, and read about it. It's the second biggest tool you have, and you've got three major tools: that's your equalizer, your reverberation, spatialization, and your sound sculpting tools. Those are the biggest tools you got, and I really do recommend you do some reading about it, because it's going to have one of the biggest impacts on your production of any of the processors, your second biggest gun being your convolution reverb. Second thing is that reverb and impulse responses. Convolution reverb was made to take an impulse response that's a three-dimensional surround sound type of deal and put it in a two-dimensional space that we deal with when we're dealing with audio engineering, most of the time when we're dealing with music productions. So in that situation, that they are limited in their effect, and they're more linear, to where, if you look at the convolution reverb, how it's supposed to be in a surround sound situation, it's coming from everywhere. Whereas, if you look at some of the pictures we've looked at when we were talking about reverb, that it's like initial hit and then, initial reflections and then reverberations tailing off, right? But it's two-dimensional, one-dimensional, linear like that, rather than surround sound. You really have to keep that in mind. And one of the biggest ways we've got to get around that, as I talked about in my first master series, about if you pick a convolution reverb for putting the things in their space, and you've got things that are sitting on top of the mix, sometimes you can adjust them a little bit differently on one side or the other, to make it sound more three-dimensional. But be careful, stuff that's farther back in the mix, you want to be real careful about doing that, because it'll cause you a muddy mess. But sometimes I got like a lead guitar or the out front vocalist that I'll do different reverberations on one side or the other, or affect the impulse response I'm using on those two tracks, being either a duplicated track or two different microphones capturing the vocalist's performance a little bit differently, with the impulse response set up a little bit differently, or affecting it differently, so that it sounds more three-dimensional and gives it more of a surround sound. So now, besides that, I just kind of want to get that out there when we talk about testing, so that it has a little bit more meaning of what we're talking about. Because basically we have two things happening. What we're testing for. We talked about a lot of things about sound sculpting your impulse responses, cutting them down, going light because it doesn't take much, equalizing them to mimic whatever instrument we're using, because it's very pertinent, especially in a two-dimensional atmosphere or in any atmosphere, that this can be very important in what we're testing for. Because basically, we have, if we look at an impulse response, if we look at it like here, that you have this impulse response and this kick drum. Well, you've got the initial response, and then you have a pre-delay on the impulse. You got the kick drum, it's got this initial hit, the initial sound, which isn't on the impulse response. You have a pre-delay before the early reflections and then the tailing reverberations. So this concept is what this putting in a convolution reverb is going to do a couple different things. Not only is it going to convolve the spectral content to some point, but it's going to convolve the levels and reverberations that are coming back. So it's going to try to take this initial sound and how it tails off. You have a pre-delay, and then it's going to grab that initial sound and how it tails it off, convolve it onto how the initial sound of the convolution of the impulse and how it tails off, and convolve them together, as well as the frequency response of that initial hit and what's tailing off, and the initial hit of the early reflections and the rate reflections, and convolve them together into this thing that you got this initial hit and how it tails off. That is going to get convolved with the frequency content of that, is going to get convolved with this being like seen as an initial hit and its frequency content, how it tails off also, and convolved together. So this can be messy, right? So it's what we're looking for and what we're analyzing when we're analyzing the impulse response its pre-delay, how, what its effect, how it's convolving onto something else, and how the combination of those and the difference of those make something else happen. Not only is it sound a little bit different, but it's also the waveform is going to be different. So if you look at it to where it's like a waveform, it's like you got this initial sound and it comes back to here, right? Because say this is at 20%. So you have this initial sound and just the decibel levels of how it goes. It's initial sound and then it tails off. So that's repeated here, that initial sound and it tails off, convolved with the initial sound of the early reflection of the impulse response and how that tails off, to where you have this totally different thing that's not this and not the impulse response, but this new thing that's convolved together. So we want to analyze that, right? And this is a huge concept. And it's a huge concept why I was really talking about a lot of things I talked about in the previous videos being very important for you to control the frequency content and the impulse response itself, which is very important because not only you can do a lot of things we talked about, but you can actually control the impulse response itself. You can get in there with automation, volume automation on these. If I was going to display my volume automation, and I can actually control with volume automation exactly how this comes up, tails off. I can control it in all kinds of different ways besides just controlling my frequency content. Does that make sense? So, these are huge concepts to get in your head, because when we start to analyze this, what we're going to be looking for is we're going to be looking at a couple different things. The frequency content of each individualities, we're going to be looking at what that convolves into, and we're going to be looking at how that happens in the time domain and the difference of that. So the difference of that can be very difficult. In the next master series, we're going to get a little bit deeper, like with MATLAB or something, but it's really hard to see the difference of what's happening there. So we want to look for that also. So basically, how do we do that? Well, remember at the beginning of the series when we talked about taking our tracks and then putting like a phase inverter tool on there to do phase inversion to see the difference of it. So we can see the difference of what's happening in the spectral domain and in the waveform domain, right? Of the decibel levels, how it's changing going from, 0 to whatever down past and goes how it fluctuates back and forth. So hold on a minute while we pull out some tools to do that. Okay, so first of all, what we have when we're looking at this is you really need to understand the importance, in my opinion, of you sound sculpting and equalizing your impulse responses. It's a huge concept that, and you to experiment with that until, it sounds good. The equalization of it sounds good. And, you can sound sculpting with saturation, noise, and distortion to help them sound as good as possible. The better they sound, the better they're going to sound convolved onto something, and or shaping them to mimic whatever you're working with. So analyzing this is not that difficult a concept. We really want to analyze our impulse response, whatever we're working with, and the difference between those, them mixed together, and the difference of them. So, you'll have percentage of it that you want to analyze, and the difference of it. I've taken this drum kick, I've added convolution reverb with this certain impulse at 5%. I've duplicated that track, and I've put a phase inversion tool on there, and then I did a mix down to see what the difference of them is, so that I can go into something like RX6, use my DAW, my spectrometer, my oscilloscope, or put it in RX6 so I can look at this impulse response. This one hasn't having anything done to it. It's just stock, cut down to 50 milliseconds. So I can analyze it and the frequency content, the pre-delay, all this kind of stuff. Then I can look at the kick itself, its spectral content, its initial hit, its delays, so that when they get convolved together, that I have a little bit better understanding what's happening and the difference of them. This is the difference of them mixed together, 5% with the convolution river. What's getting added in there? What spectral content's getting added in there? Because I have this initial sound of this drum, right? So I have this initial sound of this drum, the primary reflections and the tailing reverberations I have this impulse response that's got this pre-delay, this early reflections, because the initial sound isn't on there, how its early reflections and late reverberations are. And then that can convolve. So if you look at the difference, this convolved part right here is basically the convolution of that kick drum's initial hit, its early reflections, its later reverberations, and the early reflections and later reverberations of the impulse response mixed together with both the frequency content. So I can see what it looks like, because this here is not going to be exactly the same as the impulse response or the kick drum. It's a convolution of them both. And even at 5%, it's doing quite a bit, because at 5%, this is what it looks like in comparison to raw. This is raw, this is 5%, and this is the difference being convolved together. Does that make sense? So analyzing that, that's not that difficult. The biggest concept that I see here most of the time is you learning to listen to this and really understand what you're listening to, so you understand what's happening so that you can analyze it. So in this first video, we just kind of wanted to point that out. This is at 0% here, this is 0, this is 5%, this is 10%, and this is 20%, and you can obviously see the differences. So in the next video, we're just going to go a little bit farther and dig into that a little bit deeper. So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.